Hey, this is Mike. I'm happen to be in the middle of a Turkish tomahawk project, and I thought it would be a good idea to do a little film on what to do and how to look out for different things if you want to gas ram your air rifle, because we're kind of right there. I did have a YouTuber who was complaining because we took too long in one of my other videos, but he doesn't realize that we do this for mostly airgun enthusiasts, for people who really want to learn. Often when you rush, you lose fine details that can be added to the program of what you're showing. But we're going to go right to the point here. This particular Turkish tomahawk basically is a Hatsan 95. It's been rebarreled with a leather welder barrel. It's been pinned twice. I also have a, let me see if I can get this back here for you. I have a O-ring piston cap that I'm doing here on this particular gun. And for that, I wanted to use a weaker powered gas ram. And that's what I have here, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, I could have used the Vortex gas ram from Hatsan, but since they are adjustable, I want to save it for a different project because I did want to use a weaker ram. And now what we have is the Crosman ram. It's from the Crosman Nitro Venom air rifle. So it's a smaller ram that they make. So let's get into this. So if you're at this point and you already know how to work on your gun and now you got to figure out how to gas ram it, that's perfect. Make sure your piston's down all the way at the bottom, because you need to figure out, first things first, is how far this piston travels back to where it engages with the trigger sear. Okay, so that's going to look like this. You cock the gun, piston comes back, this is your trigger sear, and there's the catch on it. It's like a hook. It hits the sear, it jumps up over the piston, and it locks it. Then when you squeeze the trigger releases and the piston goes flying. So you want to figure out how far that piston comes back for all that to take place. Now on this particular gun, it was actually fairly easy. If you take a look at this, I'll show you why. Well, here's your trigger block, right? And if you notice where that sear is, there's the line that's going to engage with your piston catch. It's right even with the face of this. That's perfect. Now, once that's in the gun, I have something that gives me a visual that tells me exactly where that sear catch is. Now, obviously, I'm putting this in without the end plug, but the hole lines up for the sear pin, so I can tell I'm right there where I need to be, and this is at the end anyway. So what I did was basically looked at that line on the trigger block, and I scribed a line on the welded trigger bracket even with it, and that gives me a perfect mark to figure out how far this piston comes back before it lines up with that mark. So make sure your piston's down in the tube all the way, and now measure from your piston sear catch, which is right here, to that line that you scribed. Now, if you have a tape like this that's kind of beat up, men in the field who are mechanically inclined normally would go by the 1, because this can be a little shaky and not give you an exact reading. But whatever number you go by, remember what you started with. So we're going to do that. Go to the piston catch, go by the 1 to my scribe line, and I have 4 3/4, which tells me, since I started with the 1, that we actually have 3 3/4. Now, I wrote it down. I wrote piston travel, circled it. Can't do any more than that. Keep that in mind. Now I know in order for that to gauge and get ready to fire, this thing has to travel 3 3/4. Now, the Crosman Nitro Venom gas ram, you have to figure out how much of this rod will travel before it bottoms out and can't go in anymore. Well, you do the same thing. You measure that. And that's, if you really take your time, is actually to the tip of that point, 4 3/4. And this time we're using the end of the tape because we're pushing into it. We're not pulling. So it's 4 3/4, or I'm sorry, it was 4 3/8, not 4 3/4. And there I wrote that number down. Okay, so now you know that this as long as the rod's there and this is installed properly, you should be able to work out your 3 3/4 inches of travel out of this length of an arm. Now, here's what you're going to run into when you start sticking these things in. It's kind of like a seesaw at this point. Now you know what your travel is. Now you got to get it actually set up. On this particular ram, I couldn't drill a hole at the bottom of the piston. For instance, this piston already has a hole in it because I had a vortex gas ram in it. As you can see, this vortex gas ram was longer, right? The rod's longer, everything's different. So if I use that hole at the bottom of my piston, what's going to happen in this particular setup is the ram's body goes in further, right? Than it needs to be. And that tells me by the time I make an adapter, which is on my end plug, that this adapter has to be longer in order to make and meet up with that in order to hold it at both ends when it's all together. And that's going to be bad news because if this adapter gets too close to that scribed line, you follow me? Because it had to go in further. When the piston comes back to engage with the trigger sear, the face of this piston is going to wind up usually hitting your adapter because your adapter's too long into the gun. So these are the things you're going to run into. So what I had to do is I had to make another button, and this is one that I will drop at the bottom of the piston. And you want to make it so that it keeps itself centered by pretty much close to the diameter of the inside here, but you can still flip it up and jerk it around if you have to, if it went in the wrong way. That's what you really want. You need an adapter because you just can't stick the gas ram in there. It has to self-center on something and maintain that center. Otherwise, your shot cycle is going to be terrible because this is going to be grinding along the sidewall of the piston, scraping metal and who knows what, and it's not good for the ram's arm. So keep that in mind. Now, once you get that all figured out, so I know that this is too far in, so I had to make an adapter. Now, once this is in the piston at the bottom, and now I got my ram in there, let me just throw this in there we're going to do a mock-up. And I'm not even going to be concerned that it's in wrong right now. I'm just going to do a mock-up. Now my gas ram's there, but just pretend it's all together properly. Now you got your end plug. You got to reach this and get a hold of that ram. And then that adapter has to be away from the area when the piston comes back, that the face of the piston isn't going to butt up and hit it by the time that sear catches where your scribed line was, okay? Now, one of the things you got to know is when you have it all together, it needs to stick out of your gun like it is here. No less than 1/8. In this particular case, it's probably, I would say, 3/8. That's called preload. Now, the reason you need that is because you got to remember where you install this in your gun, where you start it is where it's going to end. So if you don't have the preload, which means in order to get it together, you have to squeeze it in more, which would shorten your length of your arm. When you fire it, that arm's going to come out and it's going to stop where you started. And in that case, if it didn't have the preload, it's going to hit the end and it's going to work itself loose and self-destruct after a period of time. And the shot cycle is not going to be smooth like it's supposed to be. It's going to be horrible. So you need the preload so the ram's arm doesn't reach the end of its throw. You don't need much. This case, like I said, it's around 3/8, no less than 1/8. And that way at least you're safe. Then you'll work your adapters out to see how they are laying out. You know, I have extra pistons here and you're not going to have them most likely. So what you have to do is you scribe the one line. You know where your sear is. Well, you could scribe another line because now you know, well, that's where my piston catch is. How far is the face of that? Say if it's 1/4 inch, take another line and scribe 1/4 inch in front of it, and then you'll know, hey, your adapter is still clear and I'm good to go, or it's not. Now remember, when you cock the gun, when it reaches that area that the sear is going to drop in, that's fine, but you still have a little bit more and you need that little bit of play. You don't want to get it together where it just makes it. That's dangerous. and that's not what you want. And lastly, I would say one of the other things you have to watch out for is this right here. When you make an adapter and your trigger's in, on this particular model, all guns are going to be different, you have to make sure that the adapter does not interfere with that trigger sear. Now, I don't happen to have one here, but I think I can get one if you just be, oh, here goes one. So you see that? The sear is not going to be interfered with. It's clear. Now, how I used the gauge for that was the original spring guide. Let me take this adapter off real quick. If you happen to have a Hatson, I might as well just use this as an example. The end of the Hatson plug, receiver plug, has a tit. You can utilize that tit just like we did here, and that makes a nice adapter. So what I did was I took this spring guide that came with the gun, and I know that that was designed so that it cleared the trigger sear. Let me turn myself around this way. We'll drop this in. And that's what it looked like. So when I made the adapter, I made the adapter to the diameter of the end of that spring guide, and I knew at that point we would be safe. So keep that in mind. Now, as far as adapters go, I would recommend to put the gas ram in your gun this way, and then make the steel, let me get rid of this, the steel pivot that the ram's going to ride on out of steel. Don't use plastic, because plastic's not going to hold up very well depending upon how powerful the ram is, or the gun. So for the bottom, with all that pressure when you're shooting, you want something steel or brass maybe. And the back, you can go with some type of plastic. We normally use a Delrin, and they come in different colors. Now, your adapter just has to basically grab the back of that gas ram body. It doesn't have to go on there very far, just enough to keep it so it can't move anywhere off center. And that's pretty much it. Now, some do put the gas rams in backwards because it works out better for your gun that way. If that's the case, there's no problem there. And look, if you do it that way, you still may need, depending on your gun, to bump up the ram back further this way. So you have to work out those details. Well, I hope that helps somebody out there. I try to get to the point this time, but a lot of times, I'll say it again, when you're rushing, you could have had other material that would have been helpful to know, and you could have learned something extra. But we got to the point today. Thanks for hanging out. Take care. Be safe. See you next time.